Before we get into this story, if you've never been here before, hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. Now let's get into it. There was a time when winning was enough, when a family could walk off a stage with a check in hand and call it a miracle. But what happened to the Williams family on Family Feud stopped Steve Harvey cold, not because they lost, not because something went wrong, but because something went so right that even $20,000 felt like it wasn't enough. Steve Harvey has hosted Family Feud for over a decade. He's seen tears, he's seen celebrations, he's seen families jump up and down and hold each other and cry happy tears on that stage hundreds of times. But on one Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2023, a 58-year-old grandmother from Memphis, Tennessee, named Dorothy Williams walked onto that stage. And by the time she walked off, Steve Harvey had done something he had never done before in the history of the show. He stopped the taping. He turned to his producers, and he said 4 words that nobody in that studio was prepared to hear. "This isn't enough money." What followed was one of the most emotional, most talked about moments in Family Feud history. And when you hear Dorothy's story, the real story, the one that started long before the cameras turned on, you will understand exactly why Steve Harvey said what he said. And you will understand why it changed everything. Dorothy Williams was 58 years old, and she had been carrying the weight of her family on her back for most of her life. She grew up in South Memphis in a small house with 4 siblings and a mother who worked nights cleaning office buildings downtown. Her father had passed when Dorothy was only 9 years old, a heart attack that came without warning, without mercy, and without any real explanation to a little girl who just knew that one day her daddy was there, and the next day he wasn't. That loss shaped Dorothy in ways she wouldn't fully understand until she was much older. She never went to college. There wasn't money for that. Instead, at 18, she got a job at the same laundry facility where her mother had worked before her knees gave out. Dorothy worked the 5 a.m. shift, pressing uniforms, sorting linens, loading and unloading machines in a room that stayed at 90 degrees even in January, and she did it without complaint for 34 years. She was never late. She never called in sick unless she truly couldn't stand. And every single paycheck, before she paid a single bill, she put $40 into a coffee tin she kept on the top shelf of her kitchen cabinet. She called it the family tin. Over the years, that family tin had paid for her daughter Keisha's school supplies, her son Marcus's first car repair when his transmission blew out on the highway, and her granddaughter Lily's asthma medication when Keisha lost her job and the insurance ran out. The tin was never full for long. But Dorothy always found a way to fill it back up. In the spring of 2023, Dorothy got a diagnosis that turned her world upside down. The doctors found a mass in her left lung. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, they said, but it required surgery, and the surgery required a specialist, and the specialist was out of network, and the bills that followed were the kind that make your hands shake when you open the envelope. $67,000 after insurance. Dorothy had $4,200 in savings and a coffee tin with $380 in it. She didn't tell her children right away. She sat with it alone for 2 weeks, going to work every morning before the sun came up, pressing uniforms and sorting linens, thinking about what to do. She didn't want to be a burden. She had spent her entire life making sure her family didn't have to worry about her. The idea of them worrying, the idea of Keisha crying over her, of Marcus trying to scrape together money he didn't have, was almost harder than the diagnosis itself. It was Lily, her 14-year-old granddaughter, who figured it out. Lily noticed that her grandmother had started watching Family Feud every evening with a different kind of focus, not just enjoying it, studying it, writing down answers in a little spiral notebook, quizzing herself. Lily asked her grandmother what she was doing. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Baby, I'm going to go on that show and win us some money, and then everything is going to be okay." Lily told her mother. Keisha called her brother. And together, the Williams family, Dorothy, Keisha, Marcus, Lily, and Marcus's wife Tamara, submitted an application to Family Feud. 6 weeks later, they got the call. They were going to Memphis, except Memphis was going to them. The show was taping in Los Angeles. Marcus drove the whole way. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat with her spiral notebook in her lap, quizzing herself the entire 28-hour drive. The Williams family arrived in Los Angeles on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, they were in the studio, surrounded by bright lights and a buzzing audience and a stage that looked both exactly like it did on television and somehow completely different in person. They were nervous, of course they were. Marcus kept bouncing his knee. Tamara was whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. Keisha had her hand on her mother's arm the entire time they were in the waiting area, but Dorothy was still. She held her spiral notebook one last time, flipped through the pages slowly like a student reviewing notes before an exam they'd spent months preparing for. Then she closed it, put it in her purse, and said, "Okay, I'm ready." Their opponents were a family from Phoenix, the Torres family, 5 energetic siblings in their 30s who had clearly done this kind of thing before. They were loud, confident, coordinated. They had matching T-shirts. They high-fived each other constantly. When Steve Harvey came out and did his opening walk, the Torres family erupted like it was a concert. The Williams family clapped warmly and smiled. Dorothy gave Steve a small nod like she was acknowledging a peer. Steve noticed. He walked over to her first. "Now who do we have here?" he said, leaning toward her with that famous grin. "I'm Dorothy," she said. "Dorothy Williams from Memphis, Tennessee." "Dorothy from Memphis," Steve repeated. "You look like a woman who knows exactly what she's doing." Dorothy smiled. "I've been practicing." The audience laughed. Steve raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He would learn exactly how much she'd been practicing later. For now, the game began. The Williams family played well in the main round, well enough, but not perfectly. The Torres family was sharp and fast, and they pulled ahead in the second round with a strong answer streak that put them in a commanding position. The Williams family fought back in the third round, and Keisha landed a top answer on a question about things you'd find in a grandmother's purse that sent the audience into delighted applause. But going into the final round, the Torres family had the lead. It came down to a sudden death question. Steve read it to both families. "Name the most common reason people say they cry during a movie." The Torres family's representative buzzed in fast. "Sad ending." The board revealed the answer. Number 4, respectable but not the top answer. Dorothy buzzed in before Steve even finished, turning back to the Williams family. "Someone reminds you of someone you lost," she said. The studio went quiet for just a moment, and then the board lit up. Number 1 answer, 47 points. The Williams family erupted. Marcus lifted his mother off the ground, actually lifted her and spun her around once while the audience roared. Steve Harvey stood back and watched with a look on his face that was hard to read. Something between amusement and something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. The Williams family had won the main game. Now they were heading to fast money. Keisha went first. She was quick, she was sharp, and she came off the stage with 152 points, a genuinely strong score. That meant Dorothy needed 48 points to win the $20,000 for the family, 48 points from 5 questions. It was absolutely doable. Dorothy had practiced hundreds of these. She had the spiral notebook. She had 34 years of showing up before the sun came up and doing hard things without complaint. Walked to the fast money podium, and Steve Harvey walked with her. "Dorothy," he said quietly just to her in that moment before the cameras fully reset. "You doing okay?" "I'm better than okay, Mr. Harvey," she said. "I've been waiting for this my whole life, I just didn't know it yet." Steve looked at her for a beat, then he nodded slowly like something had just landed. "All right," he said, "let's play." The clock started, 20 seconds. Name something a teenager is always asking for. Dorothy didn't hesitate. "Money." "Name a place where you wouldn't want your phone to ring." "Church," she said immediately. "Name something people do to calm their nerves." "Pray," she said. "Name a food most people eat with their hands." "Chicken." "Name something in your home that collects dust." Dorothy paused, one beat, just one, and said, "Old trophies." The buzzer sounded. Steve turned to face the board, and the audience leaned forward as one. Money, number 1 answer, 42 points. Church, number 1 answer, 38 points. Pray, the board scanned. Number 2 answer, 27 points. The audience groaned softly, but the Williams family's hands were already clasped together, already counting. 42 plus 38 plus 27. That was 107 points just from 3 answers. Dorothy only needed 48 total. She had already passed it, but Steve kept going. Chicken, number 1 answer, 44 points. Old trophies, number 3 answer, 19 points. Total, 230 points. The Williams family had won $20,000. Dorothy stood at the podium as her family rushed the stage. She was smiling, a real, full, joyful smile. Keisha was sobbing. Marcus had his arm around his mother and his face buried in her shoulder. Lily was jumping. Tamara was filming all of it on her phone, and Steve Harvey was watching all of it, and something in his face had shifted. He took a breath. He looked at his producers, and then he looked back at Dorothy. "Hold on," he said. "Hold on, everybody." The studio quieted. "Dorothy," Steve said, his voice lower, now steadier. "Before we wrap this up, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Dorothy looked at him. The smile was still there, but her eyes were steady, waiting. "Why did you really come here today?" Dorothy Williams looked at Steve Harvey for a long moment. Around her, the studio was completely still. Her family stood close. Keisha had her hand on her mother's back. Marcus had his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Lily was watching her grandmother with wide, careful eyes. Then Dorothy spoke. "Mr. Harvey," she said, "I'm going to tell you something I haven't told most people." and she told him everything. She told him about the diagnosis, about the mass in her left lung, about sitting alone with that news for 2 weeks before she could bring herself to say it out loud. She told him about the $67,000 in medical bills, about the coffee tin, about 34 years of 5 a.m. shifts, about her father dying when she was 9 and what that did to a little girl, and about how she had spent her entire adult life making sure her children and her grandchildren would never feel that kind of helpless grief, never feel the floor drop out from under them, if she could help it. She told him she'd been practicing for months, that she'd bought a spiral notebook and written down the most common answers to hundreds of Family Feud questions, that she'd quizzes herself every morning on her break at the laundry facility, that her granddaughter Lily had started quizzing her over the phone every evening before bed. "I didn't come here to be famous," Dorothy said. "I came here because I needed to fix a problem, and I was willing to work for it. That's the only thing I know how to do, work for it." By the time she finished, Keisha was not the only one crying. Half the audience was crying. Several members of the production crew had stopped pretending they weren't affected. Steve Harvey stood very still. Then he turned to his producers and he said it. "This isn't enough money." The producers looked at each other. The audience stirred. It was an unusual moment, unusual even for a show built on unusual moments. Steve turned back to the audience. He turned back to the cameras, and he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I have been standing on this stage for over a decade. I have met thousands of families, and every single one of them had a story. But once in a while, once in a great while, you meet someone who reminds you what the word dignity actually means." He looked at Dorothy. "This woman drove across the country. She practiced for months. She showed up on this stage with a spiral notebook full of homework and a heart full of love for her children. She answered 5 questions, and she did it with grace, and she did it with precision, and she never once asked for pity, not once." He paused. "$20,000 is a beautiful prize, but Dorothy Williams didn't come here for a prize. She came here to save her family, and I think she deserves more than a prize." What happened next had never happened before on Family Feud. Steve announced that the show would be making an additional contribution, a personal one from him, to help cover Dorothy's medical expenses. He didn't name a number on camera. He said he would speak with Dorothy privately, and whatever she needed, they would figure it out together. The audience gave a standing ovation that lasted almost a full minute. Dorothy stood at the podium with tears running down her face, tears she made no effort to wipe away. She looked at Steve and she said the simplest thing she could find to say. "My mother always told me that God sees the work even when nobody else does. I've been trusting that my whole life. I guess she was right." Steve Harvey couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded. Then he did something that no one on set was expecting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, the kind you tear from a notepad. He'd written something on it backstage, apparently before the taping, during a break when he'd heard from one of the producers that Dorothy's family was unusually quiet and unusually focused in the green room. He unfolded the paper. He read it quietly to himself first. Then he looked at Dorothy. "I wrote this down earlier because I had a feeling today was going to be different," he said. "I don't know why. Sometimes you just know." He handed her the paper. Dorothy read it. Whatever it said, she closed her eyes and pressed it to her chest. Later in interviews, she would say that the note simply said, "You did the work always matters." It was the most Steve Harvey thing in the world to say, and somehow it was exactly right. The taping ended an hour behind schedule that day. Nobody on the production crew minded. The Torres family, who had lost the game fair and square, stayed in the studio to embrace the Williams family before anyone left. The Torres family's oldest brother, a man named Roberto, found Dorothy near the exit and shook her hand and told her that watching her had reminded him of his own grandmother. He said it in Spanish first and then in English, and Dorothy held his hand with both of hers and thanked him. When Dorothy finally walked out of that studio into the Lowe's Angels afternoon, she had $20,000 in prize money, the promise of additional support from Steve Harvey, and something that was harder to quantify but probably more important than any of it: the knowledge that all those mornings before the sun came up had not gone unseen. The episode aired 6 weeks later. Within 48 hours, the clip of Steve Harvey saying, "This isn't enough money," had been viewed more than 12 million times across platforms. The comment sections were full of people describing exactly where they were when they watched it, at work, on their lunch break, in their car in a parking lot, not moving because they couldn't stop watching. People wrote about their own grandmothers, their own spiral notebooks, their own 5 a.m. shifts. Dorothy Williams became, almost overnight, a symbol for something that a lot of people had been feeling without having a word for it: the belief that quiet, unwitnessed hard work matters. That dignity doesn't require an audience. That preparation is itself a form of prayer. The laundry facility where Dorothy had worked for 34 years was flooded with calls from people wanting to know where it was, wanting to send gift cards, wanting to do something. Her coworkers told reporters that they weren't surprised at all. Dorothy has always been the kind of person who shows up, one colleague said. Every single day, no matter what, you could set your clock by her. The medical bills, all $67,000 of them, were resolved within 3 months of the episode airing. Steve Harvey's personal contribution covered a significant portion. A crowdfunding campaign started by a stranger in Nashville who had seen the episode and felt compelled to act raised an additional $43,000 in 10 days. Dorothy's surgeon's office, upon learning the story, adjusted the outstanding balance to zero. "We see the work, too," the office manager said in a brief statement. Dorothy had surgery in January 2024. It went well. By March, her doctors were using the word clear. By May, she was back at work, not because she had to be, the medical bills were gone and her children had offered to support her, but because she wanted to be. Because showing up before the sun came up was not a burden to Dorothy Williams. It was simply who she was. Lily, her granddaughter, started a notebook of her own after watching the episode air. She showed it to Dorothy one afternoon, pages of things she wanted to learn, goals she was working toward, problems she intended to solve. Dorothy flipped through it slowly, the same way she had flipped through her own spiral notebook in the back of Marcus's car on the drive to Lowe's Angels. "You're going to be just fine," Dorothy told her. Lily smiled. "I had a good teacher." Steve Harvey spoke about Dorothy several times in the months that followed in interviews on his talk show at events. He said that meeting her had recalibrated something for him. That in a business built on spectacle and surprise, her quiet preparation had been the most surprising thing he'd encountered in years. He talked about the note he'd written backstage. He said he didn't know exactly why he'd felt compelled to write it, only that the producers had mentioned her name and something had told him to pay attention. "There are people in this world who do the work and never ask anyone to notice," Steve said during one late-night interview. Dorothy Williams did not come on Family Feud to be a story. She came to solve a problem. She just happened to do it with so much grace that the story told itself. He paused. "That's the rarest thing there is." Family Feud producers noted a measurable increase in applications from families in the months following Dorothy's episode, particularly from working-class families, from caregivers, from grandparents. People who might never have imagined themselves as the kind of person who gets to stand on a television stage and have their story heard. Dorothy had, without intending to, expanded the idea of who belongs in that spotlight. 1 year after the episode aired, Dorothy was invited back, not to compete, but to be honored. The show had quietly established something new, an annual recognition for a contestant whose appearance had demonstrated what the producers described in the official language as extraordinary grace and purpose. Unofficially, among the staff, it was already being called the Dorothy. She came back to the stage in a deep burgundy dress with Lily beside her, and the audience gave her a standing ovation before she had said a single word. Steve met her at center stage. He hugged her the way you hug someone you've been genuinely glad to know. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Clear," she said. Steve Harvey laughed, a real, full laugh, and the audience laughed with him. Later in the appearance, Steve asked Dorothy what she wanted people to take from her story. She thought about it carefully before answering, the way she thought about everything carefully. "I want people to know that showing up matters," she said. "Not showing up when it's easy. Showing up when it's hard, when you're scared, when nobody's watching, when you're not sure it's going to work. That's the real thing. The notebook, the practice, the 5 a.m., none of it looks like much from the outside. But it adds up. It always adds up." She smiled. "God sees the work, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, so does Steve Harvey." The audience gave her another standing ovation. Lily, watching from the front row, was writing something in her notebook. Dorothy's story is not a story about winning a game show. It's a story about what you do in the years before the cameras turn on, the quiet, invisible, faithful accumulation of effort and love and refusal to give up. It's a story about a woman who packed a spiral notebook for a 28-hour drive because she was going to be ready. It's a story about what happens when preparation meets a moment, and a person is brave enough to show up fully for it. Steve Harvey has said he will never forget the day Dorothy Williams walked onto his stage. Not because she won $20,000, not because she answered 5 questions, but because she reminded everyone in that studio, and eventually millions of people watching at home, that extraordinary things are usually made of ordinary days, worked faithfully, 5 a.m. at a time. If this story moved you, do one thing right now: hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. There are more of them out there. Real people, real families, real moments that remind you that the world is still full of grace. We find them for you every single week. Don't miss what's coming next.